Our gospel lesson comes from the book of Mark, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones, what large buildings." Then Jesus asked, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when this will be, and what will be the signs of all these things that are to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of war, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines. But this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. I cannot recall a single time in my lifetime when there has not been worry or some group predicting the end of the world. And this year, in 2012, with the end of the Mayan calendar, we once again saw predictions about the end times. And just like Jesus' disciples, the question has always been, when? How will we know? And what should we do about it? Once upon a time, in the middle of the United States, there was a small group of people who thought the world was going to end. 5 families connected to one another through their church. They had spent the last years preparing for the end, expecting the end. They purchased a small but still massive abandoned missile silo and spent years preparing it, stocking it with all the things they might need: non-perishable food, water, clothes, medical supplies, radiation tablets, medical supplies, gas masks. The group debated about if they should include weapons and ammunition, and finally agreed on a small number of crossbows and other weapons that didn't depend on materials that might become hard to find. They believed in peace and love, and above all, hope. With a list of things they had stockpiled was extensive and well thought out, they had also stockpiled everything they might need to begin rebuilding after they survived the end. Seeds for starting over, picks, shovels, rakes, hoe, even fertilizer for the first couple of years. Their bunker was so well concealed, it would be hard for anyone to find. It could be locked so tightly that Genghis Khan and his armies would give up on an assault. 5 families: the Williams and their son David and their daughter Melissa, Mr. and Mrs. Harris and their twin daughters Mary and Linda, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson and their son Tom, Mr. and Mr. Davis and their adopted daughter Josephina, Mr. and Mrs. Clark and their sons Daniel and Ronald. The group valued their privacy. They didn't have a great big internet page. They didn't make public announcements about the end of the world. They simply invested their labor in being ready, in preparing. They didn't know when the end would come exactly, but they had a pretty good guess. And when the time got close, they retreated into their bunkers, locking the doors behind them. Each knew they would miss something about the way the world had been, and it was with sadness and grief that they locked the doors behind them. But they wanted to spare themselves the pain and the misery, and they chose to just miss the entire event by locking themselves away. They brought no TV, no radio, no way of knowing what was going on in the outside world. They knew when they emerged a year later, it would be time for rebuilding. As the families moved in, things went well. They fell easily into the routines of the day. Breakfast with their families, community worship in the morning, chores, cleaning, the moving and restocking of supplies. And even though the world was ending, the kids had school, which they thought was a great crime. But when school was done, the children were set free to play. Dinner and family time, and then bed. But it was during playtime that Josephine felt most alive, that all the children felt most alive. They were set free without bounds. They took to playing great games that lasted for hours, games that spanned the repertoire of their imaginations, a play that helped them cope with their fears about what was happening in the world above, and it smooshed together everything that they were learning. It was play at its very best, and it meant everything to them. Several months into their stay, Mr. and Mrs. Clark's oldest son, Daniel, became sick, and he could no longer come out to play. The children missed him terribly because each child had held such an integral part of each day's game. All the parents talked about what the problem might be, but no one had any answers. And Daniel continued to get worse. He ran a fever and had a cough. He didn't look well. Then, when one of the other children caught a common cold, the parents panicked, and Daniel was quarantined. Unfortunately, the families had prepared for just such an event, and Daniel was sealed off from human contact, food being delivered through a complicated system of containers. Josephine, though, was quick to realize the heart of the problem and to take action. When the children wrapped up their afternoon play and packed up their supplies, she slipped into the quarantine room through a small, unnoticeable hole in the wall. She would spend her limited time with Daniel, keeping him up to date on what was going on in the game and what the day had been like. Before each departure, she would hug Daniel and then slip back through the concealed door. Daniel treasured this time. When the others locked him away, Josephine embraced him in love. However, while Daniel's mood improved greatly, his health did not. The parents continued to talk about what they might do. Perhaps someone should leave the protection of the bunker and see if there were any hospitals left in the world above, hoping that an answer might be found in time. They talked about just letting the mystery run its course. but no one felt convicted enough about any of those beliefs to take actions. The families wondered, how could God have led them so clearly to prepare for the end and leave them in this place of quandary? If the world was ending above them, why were they dying below it? Had they not been the chosen ones? It was them who had done the preparation and prepared. And all the while, Josephine visited Daniel. The parents' worry began to move into arguments, wondering if they had chosen the right path and taken the correct actions. Their morning worship lost its joy. It became chore-like and routine, and day after day of inaction built upon days before of inaction. And then surprisingly, the day came. Not just any day, but the day that they would open the doors and go into the world and begin the work of rebuilding. Daniel was alive, but not well. The door was opened and the families walked out into the world. It was new. It was fresh. It was crisp. It was beautiful. The sky seemed bluer. The sun seemed warmer. And as they drove towards town, they quickly discovered that the world was indeed fine, that there had been no apocalypse, that they themselves had hardly been even missed. It was an odd realization because the world they knew, the world they had grown up in, it was the same world, but they were different because they had said goodbye to it. It was strange to have a neighbor wave at them as they drove by. Well, Daniel was whisked off to the nearest hospital and treated for a blood infection and was expected to make a full recovery. The families moved their possessions back into their homes and began to look for work. A Sunday, not too long after they had returned to the world as they had left it, the families gathered in their home church. They prayed, they sang, and it felt great. There was joy and peace as it had once been. And at the end of the church service, each person who had spent a year in that bunker was asked to share about the experience, to reflect on who God was and is in their life. Mrs. Wilson's testimony kind of summarizes what the adults were thinking. That perhaps one day the end would come. But despite best efforts, there was no way to predict it. Does that mean that being in the bunker was a loss of faith? No. They had acted in faith. They had acted in conviction. Perhaps, though, they had tried a little too hard to put God into their box. But they were adamant that they would remain faithful and carry on. The kids shared about their play and how happy they were that the world remained. And they talked about knowing how real God was. But it was Daniel's testimony that they found themselves unprepared for. He said it like this: "As we thought the world was dying, I began to die. When we thought the world was disappearing, my world began to crumble away. I could look at you from my containment and see that you were talking about me. But it was as if I was floating away from you, stuck in the in-between. That is, until one of you broke the rules and came into my prison with love and care. This is what saved my life. This is why I clung to the living. While you contemplated the end of the world, while you waited, I lived it. Are we not now living in God's creation? The world is completely different and new for me. And I plan to live every day in that good news. Daniel's words ought to ring true for us as well. New life, new creation, and new possibility is always in the here and the now. The ability to predict the end does not belong to humanity, but the ability to live in God's grace is within our grasp. The ability to live in new possibility is within our grasp. We are called to be attentive to a Christ who is continually birthed into our life, bathed in love, hope, and transformation. This is the Christ that we are called to follow, and no other. Amen.